Beer, the golden brown blood of life. It is the reason for some of the oldest recorded recipes, our growing understanding of chemistry, and billions upon billions of outdoor pisses, as well as nearly all of my scripts. If you are wondering why I occasionally slur my words, well, now you know. Beer is as old as civilization. Beer, after all, is pretty much liquid bread made up of a combination of grains such as wheat, barley, etc., alongside yeast, water, and sometimes hops. Now, hops are a flowering plant used for the flavoring and stabilizing of beer. You might be surprised that the birthplace of beer is not in, say, Germany and Ireland, where alcohol is quite common, but rather parts of the world where alcohol consumption is at its lowest. Long before Islam came onto the historical scene to quash the use of alcohol, the people of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt were growing grains along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates, as well as the Nile, respectively. This grain was grounded up into flour and then combined with water and yeast into a dough, which they could heat to produce bread. Grains at the end of the day are carbs, and carbs overlap with sugars to oversimplify. Humans grew these grains to produce starch for their bread and their porridge during the agricultural revolution. This was aided through the help of a humble fungus known as yeast, with small aerial particles which fermented these cereals. It is unclear if this was done on purpose or on accident. I suspect it was done on accident at first, and after noticing this trend several times, people started fermenting cereals on purpose. Alas, we will never know. As humans switched from hunting and gathering to farming grains, one of the most basic foods they produced was porridge or gruel, made up of soaking grains in water in order to make these starches easier to swallow and digest. Appetizing, isn't it? Don't you just want to gobble that up? Anyway, yeast would consume the sugars and the carbs, leading to fermentation. Once most of the oxygen had been exhausted, this process would result in ethanol. The closest record remains of this brewing process were found in what is now Iran, a country where drinking alcohol is highly taboo under the Shia clerical rule. Nonetheless, archaeologists have found calcium oxalate on pottery, which is the result of the brewing process. The first true urban civilization were the Sumerians, who set up the first city-states of Uruk and Ur alongside others with organized bureaucracies. In the city of Nippur, the Sumerians worshipped the goddess of brewing called Ninkasi. Yes, some ancient Middle Easterners had a goddess of beer. She was not, however, associated with another alcoholic drink, wine. I find it rather amusing that they would choose a goddess to symbolize beer rather than wine, given that in modern Western culture, beer is associated with masculinity, while wine with femininity. Perhaps women played a critical role in the beer-making process, and perhaps consumption patterns by gender were reversed. In the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest story ever recorded, King Gilgamesh's enemy turned best friend Enkidu, the wild man, was known to guzzle lots of beer. The epic story is obviously fictional, but that doesn't change the fact that the city of Uruk, which Gilgamesh was the past legendary leader of, oftentimes did in fact pay its workers in booze. It would be Egypt that would be most famous for brewing barley beer. After their agricultural production was based off of growing grains along the Nile, this produced quite a lot of spare grain that could be used for beer. The Egyptians probably used it as a byproduct of bread making, rather than for porridge. Beer was also served to seasonal farmers who worked on the pyramids. Probably not the best thing to be drinking while you're operating heavy machinery though. But who could pass off the free beer? This early beer probably was a lot chunkier than the smooth brews we enjoy today. Sumerian beer craft would be adopted by other Mesopotamians like the Babylonians, who had their priestesses double as brewers. As strange as it sounds, beer was a major part of religious ceremonies, as after 4, 5, 6, 7 beers you'd probably think that the gods were talking to you. Further to the north, in Bronze Age Europe where civilization was not as well developed, beer was oftentimes used as a way to drink safely, as the brewing process killed off some pathogens that existed in freshwater. Granted, the idea that Europeans drank more beer than wine is highly exaggerated, and most likely BS. In ancient China, beer would also be brewed from grains, but the abundance of rice over wheat meant that Chinese alcohol by and large manifested in different forms than it did in Europe and the Middle East. On the other side of the world, in the Andes Mountains, beer was brewed from corn. This was rather atypical for the Americas, which didn't really have much access to alcohol before the Europeans arrived. Anyway, going back to the other side of the Atlantic, in the British Isles and Central Europe, beer became very popular, as opposed to the Mediterranean regions of Southern Europe like Greece and Rome where they preferred wine. The Romans spread much of their influence in Europe, but the cooler climates of what are now the British Isles and Low Countries and what now borders Germany made grape cultivation and thereby the production of wine very difficult, and as a result, beer continued to dominate. The Celts in particular would be famous for their fondness of liquid bread. The Middle East and North Africa, the birthplaces of beer, would eventually have their beer production and consumption decline with the rise of Islam, taking over Greek and Persian empires and prohibiting alcohol. To this day, Islamic nations have some of the lowest consumption patterns of beer. Granted, there are some moderate nations like Egypt and Lebanon with considerable non-Muslim populations that do drink beer. Lebanon, for example, even has its de facto national beer, Almaza or diamond beer. Going back to Europe during the Middle Ages, hops was being used as the predominant flavoring for beer and to prevent bad consistencies, particularly in what is Germany. As time went on, one of the major places beer was brewed was in monasteries. Yeah, monks like drinking beer. Kind of like how priestesses were brewing beer in Babylonia. The German inclusion of hops spread rapidly, and soon it was put to the test with German efficiency and productivity, as the region became the nexus of beer production, followed by nearby countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Denmark, and the Czech Republic following them. Obviously, not all of these countries existed at the time, though. German immigrants, or immigrants from what is now Germany, would eventually travel to the United States along with other nations and set up breweries, making beer a global phenomenon. This beverage can even be seen in high consumption patterns in countries of Germany's former African colonies like Namibia, out of all places. The story of beer is one of accidents and ingenuity, the religious and the profane, a story as old as civilization itself. And that, my friends, is a massively oversimplified story of beer. Pints up and cheers.